two, one. All right, guys. Today, another fantastic guest. You've met her husband, Brett Weinstein. I think I was at one point saying Weinstein. It's Weinstein. Is that correct?
No, it's Weinstein.
Oh, it's
Actually,
Weinstein. So maybe I was saying the
yes.
opposite. I can't remember which one I was saying.
It is Weinstein. No relation to the Harvey Weinstein.
I think we might get into some of that territory later because I earlier today in preparation for our chat, I fully read. I had perused it in the past, but I fully read your toxic femininity article. And so I thought we'll go there. So today I have Heather Hying with us, who is an evolutionary biologist from a former place, Evergreen State College. Did I get that right?
It is the Evergreen State College. It still exists.
It still exists, but you're no longer there.
I don't know how long it'll exist. But
Your official title now is Professor in Exile.
yes, self-inflicted title, I guess.
Right. So I thought maybe I know you're probably very, very tired of talking about what transpired, but some people might not know about it. Is it possible to maybe, this won't be the point of our chat today, but
Yeah.
could you maybe just summarize it in 5 minutes so that people can catch up who don't know about the story?
I dread this question, as you can imagine, because it's really a years-long process. The Evergreen State College was an extraordinary public liberal arts college with a unique pedagogical model, a unique educational model, at which Brett Weinstein, my husband, whom you've had on, as you mentioned, and I taught for him for 14, me for 15 years. With a change in administration came a president who was interested in signing up with, call them what you like, the grievance scholars, perhaps, a la Peter Boghossian, James Lindsay, and Helen Pluckrose's recent project, the intersectionalists, to use their own terms, post-structuralists, postmoderns, all of this.
Or as I call them, the intellectual terrorists, but yeah, go on.
Also apt, yes, for sure. So he signed up with them for reasons that are not clear and effectively ran roughshod over a system that had been quite capable of educating a diverse, particularly a socioeconomically diverse student body, really deeply, richly, broadly. And there were things ramped up over the 2016-17 academic year, culminating in protests showing up at Brett's classroom on May 23rd of 2017. Most of the students there, neither he nor I knew any of them, but most of them there apparently had been sent by another provocateur on campus, an activist. They didn't even know why they were there. They famously now chanted for his resignation. He stood firm. He asked for not just dialogue, but dialectic as opposed to debate. And they made one of many both strategic and tactical errors when they then uploaded the video that they took then and later in the day in private conversations, previously private conversations with admin. And then throughout the week, the increasingly aggressive and violent protests to first Facebook, and then someone grabbed them from Facebook and put them on YouTube. We don't know who. And they went viral because it really was a remarkable sort of, in some ways, the platonic ideal of what is going on with regard to campus protests. And I use protest advisedly and not really feeling like it's a protest in the traditional sense. And maybe that's weird to talk about a traditional protest, but I mean, I think you can grok what I mean there. That protest is good faith, and there are ways that systems that can go bad, such that protest is necessary. And certainly at Evergreen, about which I know, unfortunately, nearly all of the details probably, and at each of the other ones of these modern instantiations, of which I know less, of course, the protests do not appear to be good faith. The initial objections are mostly founded on nothing. For instance, with regard to Evergreen, the complaint was supposedly that there was systemic racism on campus. And when Brett and I and a small handful of other faculty, mostly emeritus, requested evidence of systemic racism at Evergreen, none was forthcoming. So
actually, you asking for it was a manifestation of racism.
Yes, indeed, it is, because we were asking the people who were making the claims to do emotional labor on our behalf. right? So, I think your term is right. It is a kind of intellectual terrorism, and there are a few of us standing up and saying, this is actually going to be the death of the academy.
Right.
And when you do what you do, and when we did what we did and are continuing to do so, and Peter and Lindsay and Helen and the Christakises and Jonathan Haidt and Joe Rogan and Sam Harris and Dave Rubin are creating podcasts where they're willing and in some cases eager to talk about what is actually happening as opposed to what we are being told we're allowed to talk about. We are allowing millions, and I believe probably tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions, that may be too much, of people to see honest conversation and to say, okay, you know what? I wasn't going crazy. This wasn't me. I was self-censoring. I was observing as other people were being censored, and as interesting, valuable, perhaps true, perhaps untrue, but we have to investigate them, ideas are being driven underground.
Does it surprise you, since you spoke about sort of the large platforms that are now popping up everywhere to discuss ideas outside of the academy, does it surprise you that so few professors, I mean, there's an increasing number now, but it still remains a very small percentage of the overall population of professors who are taking advantage of these tools to spread ideas, to discuss ideas? Does that surprise you?
Not really. And this speaks to perhaps my lack of faith in the professoriate. And that didn't show up on May 23rd of 2017 when the protests at Evergreen became public. And nor do I think that it was just the Evergreen bubble, wherein I was increasingly disenchanted with the willingness of faculty to seek truth and to be courageous. I think it's a problem across faculty, across the Western world, across weird countries, as far as I can tell.
I think Brett and I might have touched on this, if I'm not mistaken, but we spoke sort of about, I think it was him, and if it isn't, it's one of my chats, I can't remember who it might have been, sort of that academia might, there's kind of a self-selection bias whereby you don't typically get the super courageous, sort of brawny, non-coward, and maybe it's a stereotype, but do you think that, I mean, is there something unique about academics that makes them more prone to fall victim to cowardice, or are they just representative of the scourge of cowardice that inflicts most humans?
Certainly the latter, right? That in some ways they and we are no different from any other population. But has the signal been boosted some in faculty? Is there a selection force for cowardice? Maybe. Are meek liberals more likely to be represented among the faculty than in other professions? Well, we know for sure that there's a left-wing bias among faculty. That's well established. I don't think, though, that on average people on the left side of the political spectrum are more cowardly or more meek than people on the right side of the political spectrum. I don't think that follows ideological lines. But I would say that, like in any profession, people want to keep their heads down until the thing actually shows up at their door.
Right.
And so I don't think it's any accident that many of the people who are speaking up are trained in some form of evolutionary thinking. Right. Like this does not feel like an accident at all. And in fact, I wrote this in a Wall Street Journal op-ed over a year ago. That it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek. First, they came to the biologists. Yeah. But not entirely. That those of us who, I don't know about you, actually, I'd be curious to know, but certainly in my classrooms, in Brett's classrooms, we were teaching evolutionary biology. We were teaching sexual selection and the evolution of territoriality and hierarchies and parental care and all of these things to greatly enthusiastic and rigorous and students who would talk back and not trust us based on our authority, but we created community and we were able to go deep with these ideas. That is what you do with an evolutionary understanding of the universe, is you don't let any idea stand just because someone that you think is an authority said it, right? So I don't think that the intellectual terrorists, the grievance scholars, whatever you want to call them, are seeking us out per se, but it is our nature to see patterns and speak about them when, especially when nonsense starts to be spouted. When dogma about, men and women are a social construct begins to show up places, we are much more likely than say, so I'm trained as a biologist for my PhD, my would-be peers in, so within biology, we have sort of skin out, whole organism, and bigger, and skin in. That's one way to characterize the division. So the skin in biologists, the people who are looking at, organs or organelles or cells or molecules, are much less likely to actually have an opinion about male versus female, and are therefore much more likely to sort of shut their lab door and say, this isn't about me. This doesn't concern me. Let me do my work. I'm gonna collect my grants. I'm gonna be the PI that I need to be on these papers that I'm working on, and that madness will hopefully be self-contained.
Right.
And I think you and I and many others are looking around going, it's patently not self-contained, and furthermore, it's batshit crazy.
Right. I mean, to pick up on your point about why is it that evolutionary thinkers are likely to be involved in the battle. I mean, definitely the content of evolutionary theory is going to trigger my resistance to having to prove that there is such a thing as male and female in front of the Canadian Senate. But I think more generally, evolutionary theory promotes consilience. It promotes synthetic thinking. And therefore, I'm able, and I think I can speak for many of the people that you mentioned, if not all of them, because of this penchant for synthetic thinking, I'm able to see patterns that otherwise many other people might not have put together, right? So I see the stress or the threat of forbidden knowledge when it comes to trying to Darwinize the business school. So then I have an oh moment there. Then I see people who get upset if you use the word retard on Twitter. That's another oh moment. Well, someone else might have seen these as being completely different instantiations of phenomena that are not related. But once you start seeing many of these patterns, you're able to put it together. So I wonder if that also might not explain the fact that we are trained, if not, we're drawn to evolutionary theory because we like to achieve consilience. And that allows us to then see patterns that many other people will miss. Could that be a possible explanation?
Absolutely. There's an initial conditions question with regard to cause and effect, right? So perhaps the observation is true that those trained in evolutionary thinking are more likely to be in the crosshairs of this thing. If so, why? Well, whichever initial condition it was, either evolutionary thinking gave those of us insight into, or we were already interested and so found evolutionary thinking as a way into thinking this way, and then it's kind of a step function or a step ladder up to getting more and more into it. And I would say just one thing in what you just said that struck me. I think you used the phrase "Darwinize the business school."
Right.
Even that language, which I know what you mean, right? But most people who are not thinking explicitly evolutionarily are going to say, see, that is what evolution is about. It is about the rough and tumble nastiness of abject territoriality. It's like, well, yes, but it is also about cooperation and systems that come together and become emergent due to forces that aren't inherently nasty, right? So it's both things. And so when we, social Darwinism is not the same thing as Darwinism, and yet we use these words correctly, but it confuses people.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll leave the evergreen story in a second, but just to sort of close the parenthesis on it, now, I guess more than a year removed from the debacle, is there anything about what transpired that you regret? For example, you are a professor in exile. Would you have, if you could look backward, would you say, I wish I still had my nice, beautiful life in Washington and so on? Or on the contrary, you lived out your convictions and it only allowed you to sort of double down in your convictions that this is a fight that must be fought?
Certainly, both Brett and I have some heartache, some heartbreak over what happened. We really did love the school and continue to believe in the educational model that was there at the beginning, almost 50 years ago. But I certainly, given that that is what was going on at the school, and clearly from what continues to come out of it, continues to go on. I mean, just this week in a end of the quarter faculty meeting, which was guaranteed to attract only the true believers, the faculty voted to get rid of the word covenant from the college because it might offend some Native American tribes.
Yeah.
Covenant was a word that was used for the agreements between faculty and students that was really quite the word had religious overtones for sure, as did so many of the words that were used at Evergreen. I always thought of it as sounding much more Christian than as potentially being offensive to Native Americans. But that's what's happening at that school right now. In a year when incoming freshmen were down, I think it's 40% this year from last year, and it was already down a lot last year because of what had happened in the spring of 2017. So
zero learning, basically.
Zero learning.
Wow.
Yeah. And I was up there a couple weeks ago on campus. I gave a talk on campus. It was it was the first time I'd been on campus in any professional capacity since the spring of 2017, even though we lived across the street for over a year after the protests. I've only recently moved. But Mike Peros, who is the most vocal other faculty member at Evergreen, who repeatedly spoke up for truth and actual justice and fairness, is teaching, or I guess just finished teaching, a program on basically viewpoint diversity and the need for it on college campuses. Much to the chagrin of the administration, they tried to shut it down, but he made it happen. And so this quarter, he's had a number of people. I mean, he had Peter Boghossian Skyped in. I believe Jonathan Haidt did. A number of people have been part of this. And he had me come up and talk to the students for 3 hours on campus. And I have to say, the comparison between walking through campus, feeling like this place used to be my home and it's simply hostile now.
Right.
And getting into the classroom with students I've never met before, but I immediately knew what to do. They're wonderful. The Evergreen students are actually wonderful. The vast majority of them are. Perhaps some of them are easily indoctrinated, like all 18 to 25-year-olds, right? And these students were smart and interested in difficult conversations. And we spent almost 3 hours talking about a little bit about what had happened at Evergreen, but more to the point about what we can do at a societal level to move forward, and what individuals can do to create value in the world while also giving themselves whatever degree of security they think they need. And that's what we talked about. It was wonderful. So, being back on that campus just a couple of weeks ago reminded me of both what was wonderful about it and how far it's fallen.
So what's next for both of you now? And here I had asked you offline whether I can pose the following sort of delicate question. Let me contextualize it in the following way. So typically, professors can potentially find a job elsewhere, although, as I found out, despite the fact that I have a pretty sizable CV, the more senior you become, maybe paradoxically, the more difficult it becomes to move, because you have a lot of baggage. There are a lot of people who don't like what you do, who disagree with it, or they're not looking for someone with your specific areas of expertise. So notwithstanding that you might have a very accomplished dossier, it's not very easy to move. And so it is really true that tenure is a form of golden handcuffs. Now, in your case, in looking at both you and Brett, you obviously come from very solid training, both PhDs from University of Michigan, top university in general, and certainly in evolutionary thinking. Yet you didn't pursue sort of the 10 papers a year, manufacturing system. You both had maybe a couple of early papers and then not much after that. Is that because at your school you were very much at a teaching university that did not necessarily reward or give you the opportunities for research, so you became much more of a teacher rather than a researcher? Or was it a choice that you yourself made? And if so, is this going to make it difficult for you to go to another academic job, since you may not have the right dossier at this point?
Yeah, well, those are good questions. I think it was both a choice that we made because we were interested to be at Evergreen. So I was lucky enough to have a choice of job offers back when I took the job at Evergreen. which is a vanishingly rare experience these days. And both of them were at liberal arts colleges, Evergreen being public and the other one being private. And I ended up choosing Evergreen for two broad reasons. And one of them was being public was more attractive to me, that I would get to teach students that were socioeconomically diverse and not just students who had always known they were going to college and it was gifted to them by their parents, and so they weren't challenged particularly by the reality of being there. But the model was clearly a full-time teaching model. And while Evergreen, earlier actually it did discourage research. It didn't actively discourage research, but if you threw yourself into your teaching, as I did, as Brett did, what we did was developed ideas in classrooms and with students. Effectively ran graduate level seminars in evolutionary thinking year after year after year with communities of students who became like graduate students. So, could we have? I don't even want to say should we have. Could we have published more? Sure, we could have, but it both didn't seem necessary. And we also, I specifically, in my interview actually at Evergreen, was asked, when do you expect to write your first NSF grant? Being in the US, NSF being the sure. big grant getting agency. And I, much to my shock and horror at the time, said without editing, "Oh, I don't intend to play that game." Well, I'm not going to get this job,
right?
And
so your trajectory was pretty much anchored at that point.
Yeah, and I did certainly look into that game a bit and decided it didn't feel like the way to actually maintain freedom of inquiry. So, much like the intersectionalists, the grievance scholars are tamping down on actual inquiry, especially in the sciences, but across the humanities and social sciences as well. The academic model of least publishable unit and adding more and more authors to your paper, such that in some cases, I've known people who were proud of the fact that they wrote a paragraph in a paper and didn't even read the rest of the paper, such that when I would ask them about, what does this finding mean? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Your name's on the paper. Well,
that's a major problem. And it's funny, if I may interrupt you, I never ever play that game to my detriment, because I refuse to be a careerist in that sense. And many, many years ago, my mother had said to me, Gad, you can't live in your purity bubble because the world doesn't abide by your purity bubble. And recently I was having a chat with my wife. And I said, I sometimes feel that my honesty is truly maladaptive, because I would have had tons more papers if not to me, that sort of putting your name when you haven't done anything is scamming. But even less, even collaborations that are fully appropriate collaborations, I oftentimes will hesitate to do it, because I always think that my standards of checking everything and making sure everything is right is going to be higher than any collaborator I'm working with. Well, what if they are not as assiduous as I am? And so I feel that both my honesty and my, frankly, maladaptive perfectionism has, despite the fact that I have if I may say, a pretty sizable CV, it would have been double did I not suffer from those afflictions. So I hear your concern.
I think that's right. And so Dick Alexander, who recently died, was one of the really one of the giant names in evolutionary biology in the mostly the late 20th century, but to some degree the early 21st as well. He was my informal advisor at Michigan and Brett's formal advisor. Was not as famous, never got the fame that he deserved, right, even though by many measures he was perhaps the most important contributor to an understanding of human evolution,
right? Like
human evolution, social behavior, and in addition to working on singing insects and horses and all sorts of other systems. But he was a purist and honorable down to every last inch of his body, and not only refused to sign up for collaborations that didn't quite feel right, but refused to ever put his name on his students' papers, even when that is pretty standard, right? The advisors put their names on their students' papers, and he wouldn't do it. And so, his work stands alone, his students' work stands alone, and it's extraordinary. And I think in part as a result, at the point that he died, many of his former students came together in discussion to figure out how to get an obituary into, for instance, the New York Times.
Right.
And we couldn't do it because he doesn't have the kind of reputation that someone who produced more and more and more would have.
Just to clarify what you said for the folks who may not be academics, I think what you were referring to, Heather, is where supervisors presume that simply by virtue of being supervisors, they're entitled to put their names on papers of students on which they haven't contributed anything worthy of a authorship. And that's absolutely correct. And Alexander is right to have done so. But of course, there are other cases where professors and their students collaborate properly, and we would expect them to be co-authoring papers, right? So I just want to make that distinction. But you're absolutely, I mean, there are cases where lab directors, as you said, never mind they can't tell what paragraph, one paragraph, they couldn't tell you a single sentence, but by virtue of being a lab director, anything that comes out of there gets your name on it. That's a huge scam. I agree with you. Okay, so let's go back to the start of your career just to talk about your book that many people may not know that you've written. I think it was 2002. It seems like an interesting book. I'm certainly interested in reading it, about your experiences in the field in Madagascar, such an exotic sounding place. And then we could move on to some of the contemporary issues that are probably keeping us both up at night. So the book is titled Antipode. And I asked you to tell me if I was pronouncing it properly. I hope I didn't butcher it too much. That stemmed from your field research for your PhD, correct?
That's right.
So tell us about the book. Tell us about Madagascar. Tell us about some of the cool stuff that happened while you were there.
Yeah, well, so Madagascar is the fourth largest island in the world, which, given Mercator projections, you don't tend to think of it that way because it's near the equator and so looks quite a bit smaller than it actually is. It's just off the east coast of Africa, but has very much less in common with Africa than you might imagine. So biogeographically and culturally, it's more closely related to sort of India and South America, actually, sort of Gondwanan land masses. So I went there. The soundbite is I went there to study the sex lives of poison frogs.
Right.
And I started going. Actually, Brett and I went there as our graduation trip from college. That as many parents do, they said, okay, we're gonna give you this trip. Maybe you'll go to Europe, and we're going to Madagascar.
Why? I'm interested to know why that particular species. How did you? Yeah. As someone who studies psychology, decision making, let's drill down on that decision. There are 2 million species that one could have studied. Why that one?
Absolutely. We'd been in Madagascar for this trip, and we're starting graduate school right after that, not imagining that we'd ever go back to Madagascar. And my first couple of field seasons as a graduate student, I went to Costa Rica and thought, actually, based on an observation I'd made, just an anecdote really, in Madagascar, I'd been watching lemurs eat guava, and guava is not native to. Was it guava, or maybe it was tamarind? Lemurs were eating tamarind, and tamarind is not native to Madagascar, it's native to India. And so I thought, I'll bet that human agriculture, when present near wild primates, changes the diet of primates because they have preferences that are for the same kind of decreased secondary compounds in fruits that we have, because we're related to them. So I thought, okay, let me see if I can test this hypothesis with neotropical monkeys, with New World monkeys. Because I'd already spent some time in Latin America. It felt more like my home base, but I knew I wanted to do tropical research, and I thought I wanted to do primatology. So I went down to study, to try to figure out if I could I was looking for a site where there was agriculture, but there was intact rainforest, and there were monkeys, and I could do some both observational work and perhaps experiments as to dietary choice. And I couldn't find the monkeys. I looked and I looked and I looked in these forests where I was in, and for reasons that I still don't know, there happened to have been no monkeys there. I've since become very good at finding monkeys. There just weren't any in these forests. But I spent every day for a field season looking for monkeys out in the rainforest, and what I did find were poison frogs. Now this is not Madagascar, this is Latin America. So these were dart poison frogs, poison dart frogs, variously called. And I happened into a natural experiment where an ecotourist lodge, a so-called ecotourist lodge, had introduced a new species of dark poison frog because they were bigger and brighter and easier for the gringos to see.
Oh.
Yeah.
This is in
And
Costa Rica.
this was in Costa Rica.
You
This
know,
was in
I've been on an ecotourism trip in Costa Rica, and I'll talk about it after you finish your story. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I ended up basically going down this rabbit hole of, okay, ecotourism is not what it seems. Ecotourist lodges are often actually doing a tremendous amount of damage, obviously to habitat, but also to just even the native biodiversity. Like they literally imported this species of frog, which was from the other side of the Cordillera, the other side of the mountain range. And my observation that prompted the hypothesis that I then worked on in Latin America for a season and a half, was the introduced frog is actually outcompeting the native frog and is driving the native poison dart frog locally extinct. Sure enough, it was. And the work that I did demonstrated that the native frog actually called less in the presence of the introduced frog. And calling is, as you're well aware, it's the advertisement call, both to say, it's only the guys, it's only the males who do it, and the males call to say, stay away if you're male and come hither if you're female. And so if you're calling less in the presence of this, big bad introduced species, you are far less likely to get mates, and you're more likely to get trounced by other males. And sure enough, they were retreating in the face of this sort of onslaught of this introduced species. So why didn't I keep working on them? Having become interested in the social behavior of frogs, which I hadn't particularly been focused on before, I thought, well, the poison dart frogs of the New World are a big, diverse phylogenetic group about whom many people have done extraordinary work. And so if I continue to work on them, I may, if I do good work, add another brick to the wall of the scientific understanding that is the evolution of social behavior in poison dart frogs in the New World. Or, hey, Madagascar just opened up. Like it was behind, basically, in the late 60s, they kicked out the French and they closed down the borders until the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, became kind of ish a socialist government. And in the early 90s, they just opened up their borders. And something like over 95% of the species in Madagascar, of the herps, the amphibians, reptiles, are endemic or found nowhere else on the planet. And no one else had done work there. No one had ever done social behavior on reptiles or amphibians there. There were, of course, some studies of lemurs, the lemurs of which are in Madagascar as well, but not very many. And so I thought, well, I could go to Madagascar, which is a hell of a lot harder to be in. It's just a lot harder to work in because it's not used to scientists being in its borders, and it's extraordinarily poor. And so, there's many fewer resources available, but anything I find is going to be new, and I get to help build the wall. That's a terrible phrase. I get to help build the foundation of the science, right, that is going to tell us what, I get to reveal what it is that those frogs are doing from the beginning, as opposed to in the New World, okay, we really pretty much know what these frogs are and what they're doing, and we can add little bits here and there. And they were similar enough, the New World poison frogs and the Malagasy poison frogs, that early on in the late 1800s, they'd actually been classified as sister taxa. But it's clear now, and it was clear the point I was doing my research, that they weren't sister taxa, but that beyond that, basically no one knew what was going on. So I headed off to Madagascar to first do site scouting and find, places where I could pitch my tent, and then to go and figure out what the hell these frogs were doing.
Well, I discuss aposomatic coloring, which obviously is something that you're very intimately familiar with, in my first book, when I'm discussing deceptive signaling and how some species will mimic aposomatic coloring to appear as though they're as dangerous and so on. And I then link that to deceptive signaling in the consumer context. But more recently, actually, when I held my chat with your husband, Brett, when I first turned on the camera, I was wearing a red wig. Right? And I've actually, in one of my SAAD TRUTH clips, I've somewhat facetiously, but maybe not, have argued that the reason why so many social justice warriors have colored hair is it's because it's a form of aposomatic coloring to show that, hey, don't mess with me, I'm fierce. What do you think of this theory, Dr. Evolutionary Biologist?
I think it's hilarious. It's definitely a signal for sure, right?
Right.
There's no doubt it's a signal. And I mean, this is one of the places where we run afoul of social justice thinking, right? We say it's a signal. They say, you can't tell us that. Like, you're communicating.
Right.
It's a signal. I may be wrong about what it means,
Right.
but your sense of what you think it means is not necessarily what it means. And that's where, that's deceit and self-deception for you, right? So is it a signal? I'm a badass and you better stay away? Could be.
Could be, yeah.
Could
I'm
well
onto
be.
something, yeah. Now, I don't know if it was in your, I think it was in your Toxic Femininity article published in Quillette, where you recounted an anecdote of a beautiful, scantily clad woman who was upset that all the men, were staring at her in the forest. Was that in Costa Rica or was that in Madagascar?
That was in Ecuador.
That was Ecuador. Okay, that was somewhere else. Okay. Maybe you could recount that story because, of course, you're going to be attacked by a lot of radical feminists for arguing that she's asking for it.
Right. Was she, in fact, asking to be looked at by walking around almost naked among the Warani, who are an Amazonian tribe who rarely see white people, and when we do come, we are expected to be respectful? Was she asking to be looked at? Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's what she was signaling.
And I think you had communicated that to her, and she was quite indignant by your response, yes. Right?
Yeah. So let me. The story is, I was leading, and this is the last. Were I still at Evergreen, Brett and I would be now preparing for our next 12-week study abroad trip in Ecuador with students and our boys. But this was in 2016, winter and spring of 2016. It was Brett and me and our two sons and 30 undergraduates, 30, wow. Whom we had with us for 11 weeks on a trip that this is one of the things that I loved to do, created from scratch this itinerary, this curriculum, after we'd spent 15 weeks on campus building up evolutionary theory and animal behavior and statistics and philosophy of science. Then we go down and we spend time in the Amazon, in the Andes, at pre-Columbian sites, Galapagos. It's just, it was really one of the joys of working at Evergreen, that you could do that, right? It was a year-long program, after which, boy, did those students know a lot of stuff and have a real clear sense of where they were in the world. No privilege there that they hadn't investigated pretty carefully, right?
Oh, there's your dog.
Yes. So in the middle of this trip, and again, these are 30 students whom we had chosen carefully. We'd handpicked them. They'd have to apply to get into the program to begin with. They'd had to apply again. We'd been on domestic field trips with them already. So we knew them well, including this, extremely smart, extremely beautiful student who, from the very beginning of the trip, was not wearing enough clothes. And this was consistent from her demeanor back in the U.S. It was, she didn't need to do that to get the attention of men, but it certainly increased the attention that she got. And she was really deeply confused about who was supposed to change if she didn't want to have eyes on her. Right. And I guess I would say, so she was wearing a bikini in the Amazon when all the rest of us are in sort of asexualizing, grubby field gear, rubber boots, formless shirts, all of this. And the Warani men were indeed looking at her. Of course they were. No one touched her. No one even approached her to make a comment that she might have thought was inappropriate. And certainly nothing obscene was said even. And no actions happened, but they were looking at her. And she approached me to complain about them, about what they were doing.
Well, I mean, she probably comes from the school of thought that basically says that the male gaze is a form of visual rape. And if you push that logic further, this is why the burqa is liberating, because it averts the male gaze, whereas the bikini is a tool of the patriarchal oppressive system, right? And so if she's taken a course in that, then it would make perfect sense that she would come to you with exactly the position that she's come to you with, right?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think this particular woman had taken any of the gender ideology courses, but maybe this points to how pervasive it is,
right? Exactly.
Right? That it's practically in the water now.
Yeah.
Right. That she, and I'm not in touch with her now, but if she showed up on my radar, we're friendly. We're good.
Right.
She didn't like when I said to her, you're going to have to put on more clothes.
Right.
Like that's what's going to change here. And then, either that, which I've already asked you to do because it's respectful, because we're here in their home, we're guests in these people's home and homeland, and you're not dressed appropriately. But certainly if you're coming here to ask me to ask them to change their behavior, I'm not going to do that. Now,
so what happened? Did she change? Did she change the sartorial choices?
Not much. No, not much. It was made more complicated by the fact that there was on that same trip, in a totally different place, someone with whom we were affiliating as a program briefly, who was making a man, a local man, who was making inappropriate comments and was creeping out some of the girls in a legitimately. And in that case, both Brett and I went and talked to him and told him that he needed to cease and desist, or we were going to have to separate the course from him. And again, there was no touching. There was there was nothing actually that went even close to criminal, but it was there's nuance here.
Right.
Do men sometimes act in abhorrent ways? Yes. And where's the line there? Well, we're not all fall on that same line. We're going to have different estimations of where it is that creepy goes over into you can't do that.
I'm sorry. Do you think that
Sure.
I often ask this question in different contexts because it always fascinates me to know when people behave in certain ways, whether in the deep recesses of their mind, they're self-deceiving about the veracity. They're engaging in self-deception about the veracity of their positions. So I often ask people, for example, do the postmodernists truly believe they're bullshit in the deep recesses of their mind when they go to bed at night?
Yep.
And so let me ask you this similar type of question for this woman, which applies to more generally this type of sort of denialism. Do you think in the deep recesses of her mind she actually knew that she was full of it? That she was it just her attempt to sort of signal victimology, but she truly, or do you truly think that her compass was so confused that she didn't know which way was up or down?
Boy, in her case, I'm not sure. And I think, and maybe this points to why we've gotten where we've gotten at a sort of a social level, where it's easier to point to a group and say they think this way, and I'm hesitating here and going, well, I'm not sure because I know this woman, and like I said, I'm not in contact with her right now, but I'm imagining her now, and she is smart and super capable and super creative, and boy, is she undermining her credibility with the way she dresses. She is, and I think the first person to ever say that to her, and it struck her as appalling that what she imagined, her actual second wave or before sort of feminist professor, not that I ever, I don't wear that as a mantle, I just sort of be a person that I would like to be in the world, and young women can say, oh yeah, you can do that and not be wearing the shield of victimhood. She was legitimately shocked by my response, but she did take it under advisement without changing her behavior right then. On the other hand, most of us, when we've learned something, don't change our behavior right then.
Right.
So I'm not sure.
Right. So let's. We talked about your debacle. We talked a bit about your early work and your field work. Have you been back to Madagascar, by the way?
Not since 1999. It's been a while.
It's been a while.
Yeah,
almost 20 years.
I spent several field seasons there.
Got it.
It's been,
so now, as a professor in exile, you're weighing in a lot more in sort of the arena of public ideas and trying to lend your voice to some of these issues. You wrote this fantastic article. As I said, I read it fully earlier today in preparation for our chat. The toxic femininity article. Be great if you give us. I mean, I was planning on actually reading a few of the passages that I thought were fantastic, but might as well just let you sort of summarize them. I think what's wonderful about having precisely a woman do this, because if I were to say the exact same thing based on identity, politics, calculus, it wouldn't somehow carry as much weight and force than if a woman says them. So maybe you could give us a quick summary of that article.
Yeah, well, you've read it more recently than I have, so so you might do a better job than I do. But of course, I am about to demonstrate my own internalized misogyny.
There you go.
Right. The idea basically is, so toxic masculinity is a phrase that I abhor, and I think that toxic femininity should go the same, should be disappeared like toxic masculinity should be disappeared. But if we're going to talk about the one, then we need to talk about the other. And so, a number of points, but toxic masculinity, is there some way that traits that are on average more male than female can go rogue and can actually cause problems in the world? Of course, obviously, right? That germ of truth, which is, you could say that about so much in the postmodernist, post-structuralist canon, right? There's like a germ of truth. It started with something real, and then it became this like hideous pearl, right? That too many people are now expanding that germ into, okay, well then masculinity is toxic, like reversing the order of expectation, or when masculinity goes toxic, that's the exception, as opposed to now we have a lot of people, including the Washington Post, who published like, can we hate all men? Right. So I mean, people will say, oh, it's not very common. Oh, you're exaggerating. No. This idea that masculinity itself is toxic is taking hold. So that's wrong and dangerous, one. But as to the original observation, can masculinity go toxic? Sure. Okay, so what does it look like when femininity goes toxic? What are the ways that traits that are sort of on average more female than male can be taken to an extent or used in contexts where it's actually bad for society, bad for people? And that goes a number of ways, but one of them, frankly, we see, I guess I don't think I did this in the piece, but we see in how the Me Too movement has played out.
Right.
Me Too, I honestly don't know how it started. I want to believe that it started with the best intentions, and it really could have been an honorable reckoning in which the vast majority of men who do not treat women badly come to understand that doesn't change the fact that the vast majority of women, maybe even every woman, right, but at least the vast majority of women, when they're young, are harassed to some degree on the basis of being young women. That truth has almost disappeared under the believe all women hashtag, which is nonsense. Believe all X. I don't care what X is. No, I won't. Right? That's authoritarian nonsense, and it's a totally gameable system. And this again is a place where having some training in evolutionary biology, thinking about game theory, is that or is that not a gameable system? That's a gameable system. Ah, look, there it was. It was gamed. Believe all women shows up, and now we have people making false claims and saying things like, men. It's okay if some innocent men go down as long as victims are listened to. Exactly. No, actually, it's not. That's anti-democratic.
So right? Then, can I then assume that you were as appalled by the treatment of Brett Kavanaugh as I was? Because some of the people in our common circles did not seem to see it the way you seem to be speaking now, and certainly the way that I enunciated the position on Brett Kavanaugh, where I thought it was absolutely appalling how he was being treated. But people that we both know who are supposedly high IQ people were completely naturally lobotomized when it came to Brett Kavanaugh. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, you may find me naturally lobotomized on this point then. Uh-oh. So this will be interesting. I think we're just on a podcast, right? I can say that was a clusterfuck. Right? Yeah. That's what that was. The mob should not have voice. The mob should not be given the ability to decide the fate of the Supreme Court of the United States. That is true, for sure. Put aside whether or not you believe her or believe him. There was plenty of evidence not stemming from her testimony, for instance, in the book that his buddy wrote, Judge, I guess, that I skimmed, that I read part of, because I actually was really drawn into this. I couldn't think about anything else for a little while. I happened to be in D.C. just as it was breaking, meeting with some people. I talked at the DOJ, and it was just beginning to happen. So there were these murmurs around it. And at first I thought, oh, well, her complaint isn't credible. But then reading what contemporary friends of his had said, I thought, boy, I'm really not happy about this, but I'm confident that I knew that guy. And no, I didn't know him, but there is a type, and I wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere near him when we're similar enough in age, when we were both in high school, or when he was in college and I was in high school. That doesn't change the fact the mob shouldn't have had a say, but that, well, it's been a while since I've thought about this, but I was killed by him. What's that?
Yeah, I was going to say that some of the folks in our common circle argued, well, it's not a criminal case, so the presumption of innocence doesn't apply as much. That has to be one of the most idiotic and offensive statements I've ever heard from a functioning brain. So from now on, what I'm going to do when someone comes for a professorship, I'm going to accuse them on innuendo from 36 years ago that they are sadistic, sexual, pedophilic cannibals to see how they respond. And if they don't respond in a way that is professorial, that suggests to me that they don't have the emotional restraint to be professors, because, it's not a criminal trial. It's just a interview for a professorship. So it's difficult for me to reconcile how someone who I consider to be a friend, who can say many intelligent things, can actually hold this position. And my explanation for this is it demonstrates that the terminal affliction of ostrich parasitic syndrome that I will be discussing in great detail in my forthcoming book, yes, shameless plug, it's my show, can afflict anybody at any time, at any place. It's not restricted to the left. It's not restricted to the right. It doesn't only attack idiotic people. It can actually inflict and parasitize minds that are otherwise quite sophisticated. What do you think of this very damning statement?
So the particular comment that you're referring to, and I don't know who made it, was that it's not a criminal trial, therefore we shouldn't presume innocence. That, on the face of it, without any other context, I agree. That sounds absurd. Right. And we all should expect and assume the presumption of innocence when anything comes at us. I also think, people were looking at, you alluded to this, people were looking at the tenor of his responses in front of the hearing and saying he got angry. It's like, well, to me, it looked like he responded exactly the same way he would have, guilty or not. Right. Right. And there's a question of, there are different kinds of guilty here, but let's put that aside for the moment. There's an accusation that he was basically a would-be rapist. And then there's a weaker accusation that he was that kind of guy who treated probably not just women, but everyone kind of like his servants and like his property. And that he was in the habit of dehumanizing people, and was some of that, yes, privilege, based on the fact that he was not just wealthy, but also white male. That weaker version, I think I believe that. Like, I don't, this one over here, jury's still out, but I don't think so.
So basically he's a jock brat kind of.
Yeah. And I knew guys like that, and no, I wouldn't want to say this in front of, hearing, but it takes both skill and luck as a young woman to avoid guys like that and what they might do. Right. And, the most literal, worst for him interpretation of Ford's testimony suggests that he was actually a nascent rapist. I don't think that's true, but it doesn't really matter what I think is true. But the more, frankly, I think the most parsimonious interpretation is that he was that kind of jock frat guy. Right. And those guys are actually a real threat to women. And it is, regardless of whether or not you are interested in hanging out with them or not, they are actually a real threat. So I definitely didn't come away liking him. Right. On the other hand, his response, his anger, his emotion, that's how he would have responded either way. There's not actually a binary. Like there's no like he was a rapist or he was an angel. Like that intermediate space is actually much more likely, including he was obviously a heavy drinker. He probably actually just legitimately doesn't remember some of what happened, right? So imagine that he's the worst possible guy or the best possible guy or much more likely some intermediate mix here. He's going to come out, and if he's the worst possible guy and he's just lying, which I don't think is true, then he's going to put on a facade and make himself look like an honorable person who's been wronged. And if he's the best possible guy, he is going to legitimately be just out of control with anger and remorse and I mean, remorse for his family, not remorse for anything he did because he didn't do anything. If, on the other hand, he knows he drank a lot, he knows he was kind of a dick, but he's had a good career and he can't believe this is happening to him and he's kind of pissed off and he's kind of worried as well, he still looks the same. So in any of those scenarios, that testimony doesn't look different. And so we can't use, for me, I was looking at it going like, can we tell if he would sound different depending on which of these scenarios is true? And I don't think we could. Whereas when I looked at her testimony, it looked to me like I can't see why she would be doing this. As much as I don't want to listen to this and I really don't want to be involved, I don't see why she would be doing this if she doesn't really believe it.
It could be that, as we've discussed earlier, and I actually released a SAAD TRUTH clip on this, it could be that she herself is completely confused about who the person is, but she can construct, in French we say chateau d'Espagne, like she can construct a form of mirage to support her political. In other words, she's not willfully lying. She's not saying, I'm going to get up and stand in front of this forum and lie through my teeth. I know he didn't do it. But she can convince herself that maybe it could have been him. I think it might have been him. 36 years after the fact, 20 minutes before they take the vote. Wow, it seems quite a coincidence. But Elizabeth Loftus, whom I know well as a psychologist, probably the leading researcher in eyewitness testimony, has built a career looking at research whereby something that happened to you a week ago, you're unable to identify the person in a police lineup. So if we just use her research, and as far as I know, Elizabeth Loftus certainly scores highly on the leftist liberal, spectrum. And if we were simply to use the world-leading expert on memory research and eyewitness testimony, whereby she concludes that we can't oftentimes identify people for things that happened a week or two ago, it doesn't take Newton or Darwin to recognize that maybe the veracity of your memory from 36 years ago when you might have been drunk, he might have been drunk, you don't know if he was there, we don't know. So again, if I am someone who is fair, now people say, well, why do you care so much about this? I mean, you're not American, you're not. Well, that's precisely why, because I actually care, again, from a perspective of purity, about the purity of the process. And it really pisses me off that this guy, I mean, it could be me next, it could be Brett next, it could be your son next, right? So and what upsets me about some of the common folks that we both know, they are, regrettably, I found out, more committed to their political tribe than to the dogged, unequivocal pursuit of truth. And in a sense, being Canadian protects me, because I always can come back when I weigh in on these issues and tell people I literally don't have a dog in this fight. I don't care. So if I weigh in, it's because I'm weighing in on first principle. I'm weighing in on a general. I don't care about Brett Kavanaugh. I don't care about Donald Trump. I care about, right? So for example, when people, again, that we both know, argue that 63 million people, all of whom are rabid Nazis, KKK members who slept with their sisters because they voted for Donald Trump. I mean, surely someone who is sophisticated has to know that within those 63 million people, or however many voted for Trump, not all of them were engaging in incest with their sisters in Arkansas, right? But yet that's the kind of discourse that they have. That's what upsets me. What upsets me... Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, a couple things. I will say that, again, I don't know exactly who you're talking about, but I imagine that whoever the particular person is, several of us were involved in a text-based conversation around Kavanaugh that went on for quite a while. It's sort of, a group chat. And it began with some polarization. The Kavanaugh hearings really did force people back into their corners in a surprising way, and that was instructive. But that what I saw was actually, yes, everyone does have some ideology, no matter how much we try to get rid of it. But that these guys, who are mostly guys, who are interested in talking through ideas and figuring out what's true, are in fact very willing across the board to listen to what is being said and to consider it. And so I guess I would say that it is a first principles approach that is what is characterizing the kinds of conversations that many of us are having. And that's not to say that we won't all make mistakes sometimes and won't all say, and again, like I don't know if what was said was a mistake or not, but that we won't all retreat in the moment to something that we've thought before because it's what comes to mind. And then maybe not even have the right forum to come back and say, oh, actually, I'd like to rephrase that. Right. So the other thing I wanted to respond to in what you said was my gut, and like, we shouldn't trust my gut, but my gut tells me that Ford knows very much who Kavanaugh was and did then. The place where I think I heard almost no discussion at all was her interpretation of what happened and exactly what went on in that room, even if it was the player she said it was, are very much up for interpretation.
Right. And
that is not to say that, two men alone in a room with a woman, all of whom have been drinking, doesn't have the possibility for absolute disaster. It obviously does. But it's also quite possible that two men alone in a room with a woman might mean that no forced sexual act could ever happen because of who those men are. And I just don't know. I don't know who these men are, right? And that's part of what was assumed. Like, if you believe her, then you know who these men are. No. If you don't believe her, then they're angels. Also no. Like, right. Either way, my gut says that room happened, but I don't know what else that happened in that room means.
Well, but the fact that you're unable to know is precisely why then he walks. I mean, so to speak, right? The old expression, or I don't know if I'm paraphrasing it right? Our system ensures that to make sure that one innocent man is not put away, let 100 guilty men go free, right? I actually had a chat on my show with a gentleman, and if you haven't had a chance to watch it, you should really go watch it, because it's some of the most gripping conversations I've had on the show, and I've had many gripping conversations. It's a guy who spent close to, I think, 30 years in prison, and then he was found to be innocent. And I actually invited him on the show, number one, because I was so upset by the story, but number two, I simply couldn't believe that this person could be so forgiving, so at peace. I thought that if this had happened to me, the way that I would respond is, I'm burning the world down. I'm right. Killing everybody, and I'm digging up the ancestors who are already dead, and I'm killing them again. That's how much anger I would have. And yet this guy was basically Buddha. And so for me, I truly do believe in the presumption of innocence, that unless you have absolutely incontrovertible evidence, he walks. And we certainly didn't come anywhere close to having any incontrovertible evidence. Therefore, any fair person who believes in the presumption of innocence, it should have been a very clear case. So, for example, when Jordan Peterson said, if he gets confirmed, he should resign, what the hell?
So I think I have an answer to what the hell there. So, I mean, I guess the language you're using, presumption of innocence, does return it to thinking about it as if it's a trial, right? And so, it is different. And, you definitely have a right not to be convicted if you're innocent, but do you have a right to this job if you're not innocent? No, you don't. On the other hand, given the public nature of this, really the only two choices for him going forward were he's either going to become a Supreme Court justice or he's ruined. Like there was no middle ground anymore. Like because of the way it happened, because these allegations didn't come out sooner, there was no way to go back to being whatever he was, a federal judge. So it did attain more power than it should have as a result of that. But if he's confirmed, he should step down for the good of the country. Was the idea, I'm sure. I haven't talked to Jordan Peterson about it, but and I read it also as a thought experiment. Let's see, how is there any way out of this that could be healing? And I don't know that the answer is yes, but the closest I saw was actually that proposal. Okay, he's confirmed because nothing has been proven, and the mob cannot be allowed to decide who is going to become Supreme Court Justice. However, there is so much anger and division about who this person is that he can become a hero for everyone who is looking for a hero in this regard by saying, for the sake of the country, because I am obviously a divisive figure, even though I maintain my innocence, I'm going to step down and allow someone without these allegations against him to come. Now, I don't know if that's the right move at all. I'm not advocating for it, but it did look to me like a proposal that was trying to figure out how could we get somewhere that's better than this. Yeah. And what it did is it just disappeared, right? We're just not talking about it.
I'm sorry. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Sorry, go on.
I think I might have said this when I first rebutted Jordan's tweet, but if that logic applies, and so I'm not challenging you, I'm really challenging what he said, or the logic that drives what he said. There was a lot more lack of cohesion and more need for healing after Donald Trump won. So by that logic, Trump could have certainly been the granddaddy of heroes by stepping down, for the purposes of healing, right? So there is no end to that logic, right? Whenever a reality manifests itself, a lot of people are going to be upset. When France lost to Italy in the World Cup final in 2006, I really needed healing. And it would have really helped me to heal if Italy would have given the World Cup to France. But France lost, and that's it. It's called life. So, no, I'm not very sympathetic to Jordan's tweet, and he should keep those types of thought experiments in the deep recesses of his mind.
Well, so I disagree on the last point, right? Like I'm part of what I really admire about him is that he shares ideas that have not yet been fully vetted, right? And that we're talking about this now, and I didn't mostly, I think, weigh in on this publicly, and it's been a little while. So, it's all a little shaky, but we're talking about it in part because he didn't, right? And because he didn't keep it in the recesses of his mind. And I know he wasn't the only person who had that thought, and I'll bet there were lots of people who had that thought. And the question remains, when we find ourselves in these just diabolically nasty situations in which everywhere you look, there are only bad options, and yet you're also sinking. You're not in a good place yourself, and everywhere is bad. Let's start thinking so far out the box that we can't even see the box anymore. Like, okay, what are some possibilities here? Let's throw out some ideas. Let's actually brainstorm. And brainstorming when you've got a huge following becomes more of a reckoning. But boy, we don't want those people whom we're looking to because they are courageous and have amazing ideas to start becoming more cowardly because they are now famous.
Fair enough. I'm 100%. I mean, no one is more anti-cowardice than yours truly. I recently had meetings with an administrator who was upset by was concerned by some of my language on Twitter. Apparently, the word moron erases all my other contributions. And by the way, this actually speaks to something that I want to, not that I want to come back to Brett Kavanaugh.
Hold on. Who did you call a moron?
It was a random person that I was tweeting with, which actually is even makes it more galling to me, right? Because that a university feels sufficiently confident that they think that the fact that you as a private citizen the worst behavior that they could document on you. And by the way, when I usually call someone moron on Twitter, it's very sardonic. I'm literally doing it with a smile on my face. I'm being jocular. I'm being playful. It's never from a bad place, right? Or I call somebody a schmuck. Or actually one guy a degenerate schmuck. I use two qualifiers. But again, so I'm with you. I mean, let freewheel. The only thing that I didn't like about what Jordan was doing is that you should also expect other people, whether they are your friends or not. In my case, of course, he's a friend. We go back a few years. That people are going to push. I mean, you can't hide behind but I was just engaging in a thought experiment, right? Because I can also
thought experiment requires follow through, right?
Follow through on his part, or in the rebuttal of people who are watching the thought experiment.
It's not, he's allowed to disengage whenever he wants, right. But if you rebut, then it would be honorable for him to continue to respond, perhaps.
Or at least not. I mean, he wasn't at all upset, I don't think, by my having challenged him, but I know that a lot of his cult followers were very upset because their thinking was, well, you're supposed to be friends with him and you challenge him. It's precisely because I'm your friends that I challenge you. It's precisely because I value our friendship that I even would bother wasting my time to challenge you. Because for example, if I said, I think that evolution is a Zionist hoax. Well, you as a friend, Heather, should maybe call me and say, hey, you know what, Gad, I think you might be wrong on the evolution is a Zionist hoax. I would expect that of you if we are sufficiently intimate. So right?
Yes, no, absolutely. And in fact, this is how these conversations are going to break through, and we can start to change what dialogue sounds like. So, I have no idea what you look like in the classroom, but I'll bet that you engage in an interactive.
I'm animated.
That you are animated, and that you're not just the sage on the stage, that you are actually encouraging some interaction, right? That they're not just brains in jars. These are real people with real backgrounds, developmental histories, yes, brains, but also feelings and bodies and all of these things, right? And that modeling that conversation is what those of us who actually care about both ideas and humans can do in a classroom, but it is what people are now beginning to do on this bigger stage, like what you're doing and what all these other people we've been talking about have been doing. And people are both hungry for it. And even those who are most hungry for it, for instance, Jordan Peterson's many millions of ardent followers, still have a hard time when they see their new hero being criticized, right? So it's still hard because we are human and therefore we are tribal. This is what social is, as you know, right? Exactly. We are social beings, we find our groups and we identify them. And it actually takes, there's no set and forget around, I'm just going to always maintain the skeptic in the back of my mind. Skepticism actually takes some energy. It takes some input to keep it alive, whereas finding your tribal identity and just falling back into it and being an ideologue doesn't take anything.
See, so let me ask you this. Do you think, so one of the things that I do in my book, and I'm not sure if I'll do a good job. I'm sorry?
Your new book?
In my new book, yeah. Which is not out yet. I'm still writing it. So I tell people as a prescription, but try to belong to the tribe of truth rather than to a political tribe. Now, at first you might say, well, what does that mean? Because, people can define truth differently. But again, I think that if your coalitional thinking, your affiliational psychology is rooted in the defense of first principles, this is what allows me to not succumb to being true to Heather or being true to Jordan or being true to Democrats or to Republicans. There is a set of principles to which I strongly believe in and I strongly adhere to, and therefore that's the group that I belong to. Anyone who is in that group could it be as simple as that? Is that something that we can instill in people as a way to try to avoid falling into political tribalism?
I don't think it can be that simple. Okay. I agree with what you said. I love it. I try to do it myself. I think I'm pretty good at it. But we're also still human. We're still made of meat. We still have visceral interactions with people. And frankly, the less visceral they are, the more anonymous and remote, because it's entirely on social media or whatever, the more likely we are to, as we're scrolling through just endless information feeds, go, oh, that name, I like her, don't like her, and we categorize first just in order to do the sorting, just as like the kind of information gathering and sorting function. And that, I don't think that can be turned off. And what we can do, though, is, and again, this takes some energy, so we work hard to keep we can work hard to constantly question our own motives.
Right.
And to investigate whether or not the filters that we've installed on our own brain, and not on our tech even, but on our own brain, are the right ones, and we investigate them.
And that takes a lot of humility, right? I mean, it takes a lot of introspection and humility. I tell a story in the book about a family member. I don't identify the family member because I don't want to publicly shame them, where we were engaging in a conversation. I'll repeat the story here, and for those of you who read it in the book, you'll have heard it here. I was having a conversation with this person where the person said, sort of almost dismissively, "Oh, those ancient Greeks, those Christians, they were so anti-Semitic." I said, "Well, I'm sorry, I don't mean to correct you, but they weren't Christian, those ancient Greeks." He said, "Of course, what do you mean Greeks? They're Christians." I said, "Well, as a matter of fact, no, they're not. As a matter of fact, the way that we mark the period is BC, before Christ, before Christians. So, I mean, they were not Christian." So when that person realized that there was absolutely no way to get out of the impasse of them having been proven to be wrong, well, let me ask you, I've only shared the story a few times privately, I think maybe once publicly. No one's ever been able to guess what that person tried to do to maintain the fact that they weren't wrong. Can you think of any diabolical strategy that would allow them to do that?
I mean, they might have argued that this is the lineage that was to become Christians, that they were.
Oh, good one. I've never heard that one before. Good, nice attempt. I'm impressed, but no, that's not it. It's got to be more diabolical, more sinister.
More diabolical yet. Boy, yeah, I got nothing.
Don't worry, you're among everyone's got to nothing. That's how diabolical it is. That person then said, right. I said they weren't Christian. You said they were Christian. So looking at me, that person basically gave me the big this, right? He basically, that person knows that we both know what our starting position was, and yet he's able to look at me straight in the face and say, no, that was the position, right? So, and was he
14? I mean, that sounds like 14-year-old.
No, that's someone who is so malignantly narcissistic that they would prefer to take such a ridiculous approach than to simply say, I didn't know that, I was wrong. And now, the reason why I tell that whole story is because, now that's an extreme example, but it speaks to, the most, the root of all the 7 deadly sins, pride, right? An inability to look beyond yourself, right? What you're suggesting and what I'm suggesting really requires the exact opposite. It requires epistemic humility. I mean, and as scientists, I think we're supposed to, some of us don't do well at it, others do well at it. We're supposed to always come with epistemic humility. We're supposed to think of things as provisional knowledge. It's true until someone proves me wrong, in which case I go back to the drawing board. And yet, even scientists, you see them succumbing to lack of epistemic humility, succumbing to pride. So is it, again, to go back to the earlier question, is it simply a part of our human nature that few of us can escape from those traps?
Yeah, I think none of us can completely, right? And so this, I mean, the scientific method itself is not being practiced by many scientists, right? And this whole move to data-driven rather than hypothesis-driven allows people to confirm their own suspicions as opposed to test their ideas.
Right.
So I would say that hypothesis generation and attempting to falsify it by figuring out like what the predictions of the hypothesis are and working as hard as you can to falsify your own cherished hypotheses, your
Right.
own cherished beliefs, that is the core of what it is to be a scientist.
Yeah.
It doesn't involve glassware or lab coats or any of the tools that you or I might have might use. But the iconic thing that people think of when they think of scientists is in the lab with the equipment, right? And that's not what it is to be a scientist. Those are some of the tools that some scientists use, but the core idea of using iterated testing, either through carefully configured observation or through experiment, to test ideas and try to render them false.
Right.
And more often you have tried to render them false, or others have tried to render them false, and they have come up not false, the more likely you are to be able to sit back and say, you know what, I think this is true. I tried really, really hard to demonstrate that it's not true. I can't demonstrate that it's not true. Please, everyone, friends, enemies, try to demonstrate to me why this idea is not true. We've all failed. Failed to falsify is a win in science. And the language is tough, right? Failed to falsify is a win? What is that? That's really hard to grapple with. But that imposes the epistemic humility that you and I are talking about, we all should want to have, and many of us do want to have. But the scientific method provides basically a rubric for enforcing it and for reminding us of how to do it.
I was going to say what you mentioned about the cues, the lab coat and the Bunsen burner as being science, and anything outside of that is not science. It's funny how otherwise educated people can succumb to this. So someone, I'm not sure if you know him or not. He's someone who's been on my show, and he knows that I've criticized him on this. So I'm not it's not surprised that I'm going to repeat this here. Ali Rizvi is a pathologist by training. Do you know who he is? Ali Rizvi? Does that ring a bell?
Yeah.
He's a guy who used to be a Muslim. He's now an ex-Muslim who sort of criticizes Islam. We got to know each other. We became friends. He came on my show. And at one point, when the James Damore story broke, the Google memo, 4 scientists wrote an article basically saying, no, this is all, he's pretty much exactly right in terms of the literature, in terms of the scientific evidence. The 4 people were Jeffrey Miller, who's a very good friend and a very accomplished evolutionary psychologist, David Schmidt, who's a former student of David Buss, one of the pioneers of evolutionary psychology, I think Lee Jessam, and the 4th person was Deborah So.
Yeah.
And Ali Rizvi, in a rebuttal, writes, of these 4 people, there's only one real scientist. And the real scientist that he thought was the scientist was Deborah So. Now, in the grand totality of idiotic statements that I could think of in the last 2 years, that might be one of the most idiotic, and that's saying a lot. And
that's extraordinary.
The way that he came up to that perspective, and then, of course, being the satirical master that I am, he unfortunately fell under my satirical radar, and so I satirized him at death for a while. He viewed it the following way. Deborah So, who's almost published nothing in science, trained as a sexual neuroscientist. Therefore, she used this thing, called fMRI. That just feels science-y. But the 3 other guys, each of whom has citation indices in the trillion, who've published 1 million papers each, they weren't real scientists because they're not wearing lab coats. They're not using Bunsen burners. They're not using an fMRI. And so I started satirizing him. So if I use brain imaging to put a salmon through the brain imaging, that's sciencey because I am a zoologist. If I use the brain imaging to study consumer behavior, well, that's just marketing. It doesn't feel right. So studying the brain of humans because they're called consumers, that's applied bullshit. But studying a dead salmon, that's real science. So even someone who is trained as a physician, not that that's a scientist, but someone who should know better, succumbs to that idea. And then I've received many emails from people where they say, well, is sociology a science, a psychology? I say, of course, as long as you're using the scientific method in exactly the way that you described it, Heather, you're a scientist. You could be a sociologist and a very serious scientist, and you could be a physicist and be a very serious scientist. The reason why I attack sociology is because it is parasitized by ideology, where you no longer apply the scientific method. But of course, sociology is within the purview of science. So what do you think of this whole big...
Yeah. Well, at least it should be, right?
Yeah.
And so sociology should be. I think, we always go back to rubrics. And so one of the rubrics, the rubric that you prefer is citations. I have a number of reasons for not preferring citations as the rubric, right?
Sure.
And they're not. I've been consistent on that. I felt that way before I didn't have enough citations for the amount of time that I've had a PhD. But it is whether or not you can and do use the scientific method is often fairly cryptic. And frankly, yes. I mean, I'm aware of that Quillette article quite well. Actually, I published something shortly thereafter. I wasn't soon enough to be in the fore. So, and no one criticized me for not being a scientist, even though I don't have the citations. But because I have a PhD in biology,
that's right.
Oh, I must pass, right?
That's right. Well, that's why Neil deGrasse Tyson is a scientist, but he wouldn't know a scientific project if it bit him in the ass. But
I don't know enough about Neil deGrasse Tyson to weigh in.
But it's okay. I'll say it. I don't mind. You're more politically correct than I am. Whereas someone else like Jeff,
I just don't know. That's all.
Well, he hasn't published anything as far as I know, but he has a PhD in physics, so he's a real scientist.
Well, so I guess you're using the rubric of citations, and other people are using the rubric of what tools do you use. And it's not about glassware and lab coats, and it's not about citations, although that's a better measure for sure. But it is about how you approach questions, and do you generate hypotheses that are testable, which you try to falsify. And theorists, as opposed to empirical scientists, may actually not do the testing themselves. This has become far less popular in the modern era. That you're supposed to be someone who's a data jockey, no matter what. But most of the most important advances in evolutionary biology, in fact, were created and were produced in papers that did not, in fact, test those ideas, but which just presented them, right? So you don't need to actually do the testing to be doing the science, but all of the pieces need to be there. Right. And so, yes, of course, the social sciences are called sciences because they have the potential to ask questions that are answerable using the scientific method. Right. Do most of them do that? No, they don't. In fact, let me see if I can do this. I heard a sociologist joke yesterday.
Go for it.
From a former college administrator. He said, there's two deans sitting around trying to figure out who to hire. And they've got two positions they can hire for. And one of them says, I'm going to hire a mathematician. Oh, why? Well, it's just the cheapest thing to do. All you need to do is give them a chalkboard, a pad of paper, a pencil, and a trash can. Okay, yeah, mathematicians are cheap. That's right. Thanks for allowing us. I'm going to hire a sociologist. Really? Why? You don't need the trash can.
Very nice, very nice. Just to clarify my point about citations, I didn't mean to imply that citations are a measure of you being a scientist, because Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jacques Lacan, three of the all-time biggest bullshitters that the world has ever spawned, probably have more citations than I could have in 10 careers. And they're certainly not more scientists than I am. What I meant to say is that these people were very much immersed within the scientific literature. They've done good science. They've been published.
The three of us. Yeah.
That's what I meant. But you're exactly right. The fact that you have a lot of citations doesn't mean that you're a scientist. Carl Jung has many citations, but we may not consider him to be a scientist. But anyways, let's. I could keep you here for another 3 hours, but we're almost reaching 90 minutes. What are some projects that you're working on now that are exciting you as a professor in exile that you might want to use this platform to hopefully promote? Tell us about them.
Oh boy, I should have been prepared for that question, and I'm not. There's some chance that Brett and I are working on a book together.
Oh, good.
That will pick up on a project we've been talking about for many years. That the debacle at Evergreen, the unfortunate debacle at Evergreen, maybe allows us to get out into the world around basically using an evolutionary toolkit to understand who you are as a human and how to move forward into the world in the 21st century when so much is remote from much of how we have lived in the past.
So a book that uses evolutionary theory as a prescription to how to live life?
Yeah,
Okay.
that is not a soundbite I had generated, but that sounds about right.
Okay,
Yeah.
right. So that might fit all. I mean, of course, that's very much within my wheelhouse. But someone like David Sloan Wilson has spent his life trying to do stuff like that. Is that is that right?
Well, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned D.S. Wilson, because I guess Brett and Wilson are going to be on stage at some point soon, arguing about multi-level selection.
Oh, right. Okay.
Yes. So, this is not, separately, we both, but Brett in particular, has a narrower but more theoretical book on evolutionary thinking that he would like to get out there. That feels to me more like the kind of work that D.S. Wilson has done, although from a different angle with some different conclusions than Wilson has. More for a broader audience, the book that Brett and I are talking about writing together.
So how far is this just in the preparation stage, or have you written a lot of it, or what?
We're just beginning to talk about it.
Okay, got you. All right. Well, as I always say to all my guests, because they're always so fascinating. I could keep you here for another 3 hours, Heather. Hopefully, we'll do it again. Maybe next time I could find how to bring Christina Huff Summers, because I think at one point we had all thought it would be a great idea to have all three of us electronically. I'll try to see if there's a way to split the screen in three so that we can have both of you guys and myself chat. Maybe that'll be the next time around.
That would be great. And she and I spend time in the same place with some regularity, so we could even do it from the same screen.
Oh, that'd be fantastic.
Yeah, wonderful.
Stay on the line.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Stay on the line, and I should probably have it up later today or tomorrow. Thanks, Heather.
All right.
Cheers.
Wonderful.
Hi, everybody. This is Gatsad. I hope that you enjoyed my expansive chat with Heather. It takes a lot of time and effort to put this content together for you guys, which is freely available. If you'd like to support my efforts, you can head off to my Patreon account and or PayPal, or even if you're interested in purchasing some SAAD TRUTH merchandise, you can head off to the SAAD TRUTH online store, and purchase some merchandise.